Citlali is our first Natalan Cryo unit, and she's actually going to be a formidable support with the ability to buff a playstyle that was starting to be forgotten. She's cheap to build, useful, actually can deal some pretty nice damage, but she has a few caveats we're going to explore in this video. As always, we will talk about how and why she works, best builds, teams, talent priority, constellations, hidden details, and more. Welcome to my Citlali full guide. Her skill is where her kit gets interesting, and I'm going to use it to explain her overall game plan. Once it is cast, you deal a little bit of damage and get a cryo shield that scales with elemental mastery. The first shield in the game to fully scale off this stat, aside from crystallized shields I guess. It also makes her enter the Night Soul Blessing state with 24 points. The Night Soul points for this character are quite important, because if you have more than 50, her little pillow, its papa, will start consuming them to attack, and that happens even if she's off-field and does so every second. With a 2 seconds internal cooldown, she will actually apply a cryo every 2 seconds. Since you start with just 24 points, we need quite a few to reach 50. But of course, she has other ways to generate them. Burst is a potentially pretty big nuke that also generates 24 Night Soul points with the cast and 3 more right after. This already puts us over the 50 we need. Her Ascension talents also have ways to increase her Night Soul points to maintain her off-field cryo application going. Ascension 1 is one of her main talents, since triggering Frozen or Melt while its papa is active will decrease nearby enemies' resistance to Pyro and Hydro by 20% for 12 seconds. The reactions will also give her 16 Night Soul points, but with 8 seconds of cooldown. The other passives increase her damage greatly depending on her elemental mastery and also give her, once again, 4 Night Soul points every Night Soul burst. So to recap, skill and burst are almost mandatory in a given rotation if you want her to apply cryo field. Frozen or Melt will give you a Red Shred for Hydro and Pyro. As we will see later, Citlali will be very relevant in melt teams, where she is also able to melt her own burst, and by doing so, she will not only activate her entire kit, but also potentially deal one big instance of damage. Her rotations will generally work around her short cooldowns, 15 for the burst and 16 for the skill. And honestly, that's pretty much it. She's quite easy to play and understand. Trigger Melt or Freeze, skill and burst, maybe one normal attack to further make sure cryo is on the enemy in melt teams, and then switch off. The talent priority is going to change depending on the player's preference. Technically it's burst over skill for damage and skill over burst for survivability. The attack talent can be left at level 1 as it's only useful to apply cryo on demand. So let's look at how to build her. There are not many options to choose from, but each one has its pros and cons. When looking at weapons, let's get one thing out of the way first, and that's how much shield each weapon gives us. So here's a chart that showcases different elemental mastery values from different weapons. Obviously, her signature weapon with the incredible amount of 365 elemental mastery is going to be the strongest option in that regard. But what about the value outside of getting a bigger shield? The probably most common option for Citlali is going to be Trailing Tales of the Dragon Slayer. Her rotation can fit this weapon perfectly by going right before your damage dealer, who is now enjoying an entire artifact main stat worth of attack percentage from this extremely cheap and free 3-star weapon. And that can very likely be better than her signature weapon in terms of damage given to your carry. But there are a few obvious and a few not so obvious aspects that make this weapon not perfect. The easiest thing to notice is that its HP substat does nothing to Citlali, so we're missing out on better shield and higher melt damage. And of course you're not using Trailing Tales if your carry is not an attack scaler, but this is all pretty normal. However, a problem that might go underlooked is that Citlali has a unique extra perk of allowing rotations that are much shorter thanks to her 15 and 16 seconds cooldown to her burst and skill. This can be used by characters like Arlecchino and Mavuika to match this timing and simply be on field faster and more often. Trailing Tales doesn't like that. This weapon wants you to be back on Citlali after 20 seconds, otherwise its buff would simply be cut in half. Here is one example that showcases a Mavuika team in which Trailing Tales does not perform as well as you might imagine, even if Mavuika really wants that 48% attack. Citlali's signature weapon and many other options will perform very similarly. However, these are calcs that account for many rotations, and they don't tell us the entire picture. The stronger your team, the stronger your carry, and the more chances of you not needing a second rotation, which goes in favor of Trailing Tales. Or in longer rotations, the 20 seconds cooldown problem might not even be present. Her signature, for example, fixes any issue by simply having a 28% damage boost to whoever is on field, and having the effect last 15 seconds after creating a shield. This buff is basically permanently up and swaps between teammates. Is this worth pulling for? Very likely not, but at least worth considering. As we will see later, her constellations are generally much better if you're considering vertical investment. Other weapons can be useful, but fail to deliver the amount of buffs these two we just talked about. Wandering Evenstar at lower refinement doesn't even come close to the amount of attack Trillion Tales can give, but it's to the entire party and a higher refinement is a bit more competitive. Plus, it's an elemental mastery weapon after all. Nahida's signature is just a big elemental mastery stat stick with a very tiny bit to your team, and Sacrificial Fragment is probably the cheapest way to get some elemental mastery. One more option could be Favonius Codex. Energy recharge is going to be important for Citlali, but again, Trillion Tales and Signature are going to be generally better than any other option. Technically niche and usable are Magic Guide, Prototype Ember for its passive, or honestly pretty much anything. For artifacts and stats, it gets extremely simple. Cinder City is the only option that makes sense. However, there are teams where there is also another character that can use it. Most notably, this happens to the amazing duo of Xilonen and Citlali, which is going to be very popular for characters like Arlecchino and Mavuika. When this happens, it actually makes sense to have Citlali on the set rather than Xilonen, because not only in such teams Citlali would buff herself together with a pyro character, but also because the extra energy provided by the 2-piece bonus is quite important to Citlali. Xilonen in this case should actually run something like Archaic Petra. Of course, technically there are other sets that can be used among any of the supportive options or damage-oriented sets, but generally, even with an Atlan supporting the team, she would rather pick Cinder City. As far as stats, there are 3 things you can do. You can maximize her shield strength with a full Elemental Mastery build, you can go full damage, but still keep an Elemental Mastery sense, since it will always do more damage than attack percentage, or just mix and match your artifacts to find the balance between shield and damage that feels most comfortable to you. Whatever the options, it's important to carry around enough energy recharge to burst reliably and activate her full kit right away. For this, energy recharge sense is totally an option, and especially with quicker rotations like we mentioned earlier for Arlecchino and Mavuika, it can very likely become a must. Substats prioritize any energy recharge missing, and then the usual toss-up between Elemental Mastery and Crit. Attack percentage is technically not useless, but much weaker than Elemental Mastery. Let's look at her first 2 constellations and then her teams. C1 is basically a mini Shenhe kit. Pressing her skill gives her 10 stacks of Stellar Blades. Every time a character deals damage with basically anything from their kit, one will be consumed and increase damage by 200% of Citlali's Elemental Mastery. If she has 1000 Elemental Mastery, that's 2000 damage. But this is an additive damage bonus, meaning that this small number gets greater as it gets multiplied by things like damage percentage, crit, and reactions. Every 8 seconds, 3 stacks can be replenished by triggering Frozen or Melt. Using her skill again will refresh the stacks, which I guess could open up for some weird Sacrificial Fragments setup. C2 is a co-op shield with an extra 125 Elemental Mastery for Citlali and a whopping 250 to whoever is on field under her shield. Additionally, her Rash Shred is increased by 20%, making it 40% in total, matching Xilonen or Viridescent Veneer. Both constellations are generally better than her signature weapon, and ideally work even better with melt teams rather than non-reaction ones. This is because her C1 additive damage bonus is multiplied by amplifying reactions, like melt, and C2's Elemental Mastery is fantastic for somebody triggering such reactions. So, what kind of teams can we expect from this melt support character? And is it all about melts? What about her Hydro Rash Shred, or other teams? Let's start with Melt. The obvious choice is Mavuika, since Citlali's Night Soul Points consumption will help Mavuika's damage greatly, but still not as much as someone like Xilonen, which, as you might guess, goes along perfectly in the team. At this point we're getting a bunch of Rash Shred, damage percentage, and reaction damage. The only thing missing is Bennett with his huge attack buff, and we made one of, if not the strongest, Mavuika team out there. Citlali by herself is not always capable of enabling every single melt to Mavuika, but even the worst case scenario would still be worth it. Mavuika can also use different teammates at the expense of her fighting spirit, which is not much of a problem for other damage dealers. If you're looking for more Mavuika information, and this team in particular, I also published a full Mavuika guide. Moving on, characters like Gaming and Arlecchino will probably see a spotlight in the community thanks to Citlali. Technically, she can also play with all the other pyro damage dealers, but often she won't apply enough cryo to sustain them fully, which means you can go for 2 routes, doubling up on the cryo application with any other cryo fielder. This would be the most straightforward approach. But you could also slot a Hydro unit together with Citlali, which is a playstyle that I imagine many will go for that has a few pros and cons. Imagine Citlali buffing both your Hu Tao and Xilonen, since she will shred Pyro and Hydro. Plus Cinder City can technically buff both with separate reactions. You're mostly getting vaporizes, but a few melts here and there from a frozen aura can surely happen. The problem with this approach is that the Abyss very likely contains boss type enemies which can't have a frozen aura, and when that happens at the wrong time it can lead to losing reactions. A similar problem can also happen against freezable enemies when playing Claymore characters or blunt attacks in general, since they will prioritize Shatter over Melt. A pseudo pyro damage dealer is also Chaska. Citlali is definitely a good character to Chaska, but it ideally includes Hydro, which for Chaska probably means Furina. And the same issue I just explained against bosses presents itself again, although it might be less important here due to the randomness of Chaska's kit and reactions to begin with. Moving away from Pyro, focusing on Hydro damage and ignoring Melt reactions doesn't leave us with many options. Probably the most useful place for her would be in a Novilat team, which will enjoy 20% Rush Shred and 40% Hydro damage. Here we don't rely on the enemy staying frozen, so boss or non-boss doesn't really matter to us. In actual freeze teams, like Ayaka, Citlali is basically just a Cryonathlon character that can carry Thrilling Tales, which is honestly quite good by itself. It's just that her kit won't work at its full potential and you don't really need a shield for a freeze team, generally at least. Then any other teams where you only care about Cinder City and a supportive catalyst can welcome Citlali very easily. As long as she's not disrupting your rotations, she could be anywhere, even in a danger team. And that was Citlali. Just like Mavuka, she will get a 7 advanced tip series, that is once I figure them out. Like or sub if you enjoyed the video and see you next time.